President Trump has stated that he wants to actually meet. We're talking about a face-to-face, sit-down meeting with Putin and with Zelensky. And that's a huge step in the right direction. Absolutely massive, because this is President Trump, and when it comes to the art of the deal, there's just nobody like President Trump. More than that, President Trump really is committed, truly committed to peace. Seeing that his legacy, he wants to be remembered as a peacemaker, and blessed are the peacemakers. That's a good thing. And so when it comes to getting the three of these powerful men, two more powerful than the other, Zelensky, but still, nevertheless, three of these powerful men in a room together, sitting down, face to face, that can go in some wonderful directions, including, of course, ending this ridiculous war. It does need to end. It absolutely does need to end, because we're talking about thousands of Russian and Ukrainian soldiers that are dying for what? The actual front line of this war hasn't really changed at all in 2 years. In over 2 years. And so every day we're talking about hundreds to even, yes, thousands of soldiers and civilians that are dying for nothing, as far as like there's no forward, no backwards. It's very much like the Western Front in World War I. And this is on my mind because actually just the other day, with my wife, we sat down, we watched the first Wonder Woman movie, right? DC Comics, Wonder Woman. You got Zack Snyder, and you have Wonder Woman, who there's that scene where she's there on the Western Front, and then she's talking with Steve, right? The love interest, Steve, and Steve talks about how that this battalion, they have been right here, in these trenches at this very location for the last year, that there has been no forward progress whatsoever. None. They haven't really moved an inch in over a year. And yet every day it's just bombardment, it's mortar firing and shelling, people dying, thousands dying. And it's like, yes, I know, it's a movie. But nevertheless, it's just on the mind where that was the reality of the Western Front. That the Western Front, you'd have a little bit of progress this direction and then push back this direction, and then a little bit of progress this direction and then push back this direction. And millions are dying for what? For nothing. For absolutely nothing. And it's a very, very similar thing, of course, that's going on right now, Russia and Ukraine. In fact, it was Elon Musk who talked about this very thing. This was earlier this year. Let's give this a watch.
We should have empathy for the thousands of people that are dying every day in trenches, for no movement in the lines. So the borders remain the same. For the past 2 years, thousands of people have died every week for nothing. For what? And I take great offense at those who put the appearance of goodness over the reality of it. Those who virtue signal and say, oh, we can't give in to Russia, but have no solution to stopping thousands of kids dying every day. They just want that to continue forever. I have contempt for such people. I don't want to make that clear.
Yeah. So you're optimistic.
Because they're virtue signaling, and their lack of a solution means that kids don't have a father. It means that parents lost a son. For what? Nothing.
Right. Absolutely nothing. For 2 years, just over 2 years, the lines have really not changed at all. It's just another World War I, image of the Western Front, of no forward movement, no push in any direction. It's just thousands dying for absolutely nothing. And such a war, it of course has to be brought to an end. It has to. However, and this is a fear, certainly of mine, that you'll have to forgive me. I forgot the name of this particular Greek philosopher, but there was an ancient Greek that talked about bringing wars to a conclusion. And he talked about that there's really just two ways that a war can be brought to a conclusion. Either A, there's a clear and decisive victory from one side over the other, and the other side is so broken as a result of the war, their spirit is so broken that they have no desire to fight again. Like they have absolutely no desire to fight again. And that is that's something that we can see, say, at the end of World War II. World War II, with the Allied forces primarily against Germany and then also against Japan in the Pacific, the Axis powers were so demoralized and defeated and crushed at the end of World War II that they just have no desire to fight again. None whatsoever. And then with the implementation of the Marshall Plan of actually having the Allied forces, primarily the United States and the UK, going in and rebuilding Germany, and also America, United States rebuilding Japan, that actually helps to make amends with those that were our former greatest enemies to actually ultimately become our friends. And it works. That works. But the enemy does need to be crushed in order for that to be the outcome. That they have to be, their spirits have to be just broken, shattered as a result of war. That they have no taste for war, no desire for war again. However, the same, once again, please forgive me, forgot the name, it's just slipped my mind, but we have this same Greek philosopher that also talked about there's a second way that a war can be brought to an end. And that can be brought to an end through political means and just coming to an agreement, with each other. And in such a case, both sides, neither one of them are crushed. Neither one of them have lost the taste for war, for battle. And you're basically looking at like an armistice with the conclusion of World War I. World War I is brought to a close with this armistice. And the Germans, they felt like they had been betrayed. The Germans felt like they too much blame had been put on them for the war, and there's a degree of that. That's true. I mean, there was a lot of aspects of World War I that, led to, that horrendous, war. A war which was so horrendous, people genuinely believe that it was the war to end all wars. Because up until that time, it certainly was. It was the greatest and most horrific war that the world had ever seen. But the Germans, they still had a taste for battle. And they felt this bitterness and this resentment. And that bitterness and that resentment was what actually led to the rising up of Adolf Hitler into power and the Nazis, which ultimately brought about a greater and more destructive war with World War II. And that's the fear, is that when wars are brought to a conclusion, not with a clear victory, a victor and one that has lost, and all taste for battle, has been beaten out of them, I guess you could actually say. Well, then ultimately what you're looking at is just postponing a greater war in the future. And while I do want this war between Russia and Ukraine to end, of course I want this war to end. I mean, it's insane, and it is horrific that you have thousands of soldiers and civilians on both sides dying just about every day to every week, certainly every week. I want it to end. We all want it to end. This is a war that should never have happened, and it wouldn't have happened if President Trump had rightfully won in 2020 and the election had not been stolen. I want it to end, and yet the fear that I have is that it ends with diplomacy. It ends with, these political means. And it's the same kind of thing that we see with Gaza, and Netanyahu now talking about, now I'm hoping that it's not going to actually end up that way. It was like, we'll give Gaza to a Arab authority, some other Arab authority. And it's like, dude, you're just postponing a more horrific thing in the future. You're just postponing something in the future that's going to be so much worse. It's a similar thing that we see with North Korea and South Korea, that it's just generations of continued tensions and conflict, and it's just like, well, there's an agreement, there's a border between it, and it's like, yes, as of now, nothing has happened, but North Korea certainly wants something to happen. They still have a taste for war. They have a desire for war still, and in the future, God forbid, but in the future, we could still be looking at North Korea coming in to South Korea with its nuclear weapons. And now you're looking at something so much more devastating than if the war had been concluded in another way. So this is just the nature of war, and it sucks. Like, no matter what, no matter how you look at it, it sucks. But that's basically how war can be brought to an end, is that you have a clear winner and a clear loser, and all taste for battle has just been totally beaten out of the people. Their spirits broken to the point where it's like, we're just done with this. We're not gonna take up arms again. We just don't want to have anything to do with that. And the result can be multiple generations of, yes, peace. But when you have war conclude with just this agreement, do you think Russia and Ukraine, like, the bitterness between these people is now obviously enormous, totally enormous, where you have the Ukrainians that they think that they've obviously been betrayed, that they want blood, they want vengeance, and same thing with Russia. The Russians, have lost hundreds of thousands. They want vengeance. Somebody could be saying, and a lot of people do, it's like, well, this is Russia's fault. Russia's the one that actually went into Ukraine in 2022. And so, to hell with Russia and how they feel about this. This needs to end, But this is where there's a lot of messy history involved with this. And that messy history needs to be understood. That even the United States of America, we have played a tremendous role in this to bring this ultimately about. And I just want to provide you with some of that context and some of that history. That when it came to the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe, NATO, certain promises were made to Russia concerning NATO. Promises that we will not be expanding further east. And these are promises that were made and promises that were broken again and again and again, which Russia, over decades of time, told us, stop. You guys promised that you wouldn't actually expand NATO, that you wouldn't push eastward. And now here you are, expanding further. Until ultimately, the Ukraine itself, which is right there on the border of Russia, is invited into NATO. And Russia is going, we've been dealing with you and your broken promises for over 20 years now. You think that we're just going to sit back and allow this to happen? Something has to be done to show the Western countries, all, the European countries, along with, UK and the United States, that we will not be pushed around. We will protect our people and our sovereignty. Because when it comes to Vladimir Putin, Russia first is his priority. Russia and the Russian people and the protection of his people is his priority. And he has always seen NATO as an extreme threat, an existential threat to Russia and its people, its sovereignty. And so it's continually pushing eastward until it's right on his doorstep. And it's like, what do you think he's going to do? There's an individual, Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs is his name. And when it comes to truth bombs that are just dropped concerning the Russia-Ukraine incident, the war, this guy just, he lays it on the line. He just absolutely drops these bombs. And let's give this a watch. This is Jeffrey Sachs on Piers Morgan. This was last year of 2024.
Yanukovych, and within...
You seem very reliant on accepting Putin's worldview rather than perhaps the stark reality of the barbarism with which he's executed this war.
Yeah, maybe because I know too much about the United States, because the first war in Europe after World War II was the U.S. bombing of Belgrade for 78 days to change borders of a European state. The idea was to break Serbia, to create Kosovo as an enclave, and then to install Bondesteel, which is the largest NATO base in the Balkans, in the Southwest Balkans. So the U.S. started this under Clinton, that we will break the borders, we will illegally bomb another country. We didn't have any UN authority. This was a, quote, NATO mission to do that. Then I know the United States went to war repeatedly, illegally, in what it did in Afghanistan, and then what it did in Iraq, and then what it did in Syria, which was the Obama administration, especially Obama and Hillary Clinton, tasking the CIA to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, and then what it did with NATO illegally bombing Libya to topple Muammar Gaddafi, and then what it did in Kiev in February 2014. I happened to see some of that with my own eyes. The U.S. overthrew Yanukovych together with right-wing Ukrainian military forces. We overthrew a president. And what's interesting, by the way, is we overthrew Yanukovych the day after the European Union representatives had reached an agreement with Yanukovych to have early elections, a government of national unity, and a stand down of both sides. That was agreed. The next thing that happens is the opposition, quote unquote, says we don't agree. They stormed the government buildings and they deposed Yanukovych. And within hours, the United States says, yes, we support the new government. It didn't say, oh, we had an agreement. That's unconstitutional what you did. So we overthrew a government, contrary to a promise that the European Union had made. And by the way, Russia, the United States, and the EU were parties to that agreement. And the United States, an hour afterwards, backed the coup. Okay, so everyone's got a little bit to answer for. In 2015, the Russians did not say, we want the Donbass back. They said peace should come through negotiations, and negotiations between the ethnic Russians in the east of Ukraine and this new regime in Kiev led to the Minsk II agreement. The Minsk II agreement was voted by the UN Security Council unanimously. It was signed by the government of Ukraine. It was guaranteed explicitly by Germany and France. And you know what? And it's been explained to me in person. It was laughed at inside the US government. This is after the UN Security Council unanimously accepted it. The Ukrainians said, we don't want to give autonomy to the region. Oh, but that's part of the treaty. The US told them, don't worry about it. Angela Merkel explained in Die Zeit, in a notorious interview after the 2022 escalation, she said, oh, you know, we knew that Minsk II was just a holding pattern to give Ukraine time to build its strength. No, Minsk II was a UN Security Council unanimously adopted treaty that was supposed to end the war. So when it comes to who's trustworthy, who to believe, and so forth, I guess my problem, Piers, is I know the United States government. I know it very well. I don't trust them for a moment. I want these two sides actually to sit down in front of the whole world and say, these are the terms. Then the world can judge. Because we could get on paper clearly for both sides of the world, we're not going to overthrow governments anymore, the United States needs to say. We accept this agreement, the United States needs to say. Russia needs to say we're not stepping 1 foot farther than whatever the boundary is actually reached. And NATO's not going to enlarge. And let's put it for the whole world to see. You know, once in a while, treaties actually hold.
Let me just explain in 2 minutes the Ukraine war. This is not an attack by Putin on Ukraine in the way that we are told every day. This started in 1990. James Baker III, our Secretary of State, said to Mikhail Gorbachev, NATO will not move 1 inch eastward if you agree to German unification. The U.S. then cheated on this, already starting in 1994, when Clinton signed off on a plan to expand NATO all the way to Ukraine. This is when the so-called Neocons took power. The expansion of NATO started in 1999 with Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic. Then the U.S. led the bombing of Serbia in 1999. That was a use of NATO to bomb a European capital, Belgrade, 78 straight days to break the country apart. The Russians didn't like that very much. But even Putin started out pro-European, pro-American, actually. He asked maybe we should join NATO when there was still the idea of some kind of mutually respectful relationship. 9/11 came, then came Afghanistan, and the Russians said, yeah, we'll support you. We understand to root out terror. In 2002, the United States unilaterally walked out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. What it did was trigger the U.S. putting in missile systems in Eastern Europe that Russia views as a dire, direct threat to national security by making possible a decapitation strike of missiles that are a few minutes away from Moscow. In 2004-05, we engaged in a soft regime change operation in Ukraine, the so-called First Color Revolution. But in 2009, Yanukovych won the election, and he became president in 2010 on the basis of neutrality for Ukraine. So in February 22nd, 2014, the United States participated actively in the overthrow of Yanukovych. They intercepted a really ugly call between Victoria Nuland and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, who's a senior State Department official till today. And they talked about regime change. So they made the new government. The U.S. then said, okay, now NATO's really going to enlarge. And Putin kept saying, stop. You promised no NATO enlargement. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, 7 more countries in the not 1 inch eastward. On December 15th, 2021, Putin put on the table a draft Russia-U.S. security agreement. The basis of it is no NATO enlargement. The special military operation started, and 5 days later, Zelensky says, okay, neutrality. And then the United States and Britain said, no way. You guys fight on. We got your back. We don't have your front. You're all going to die. But we got your back. That's 600,000 deaths now of Ukrainians since Boris Johnson flew to Kyiv to tell them to be brave. Absolutely ghastly. We have to understand we're not dealing with, as we're told every day, with this madman like Hitler. This is complete bogus, fake history that is a purely PR narrative of the U.S. government, we're playing games here. So, God forbid a nuclear power comes at us. I don't know what's going to happen. But we came at them.
When it comes to Russia's reasons for invading Ukraine, it's because of all of the decades of these neocon powers in the United States government that are constantly making promises to Russia and then constantly breaking those promises with Russia, and overthrowing governments and establishing our own puppet in there that we like and we can control. Now, this is not about the Trump administration, but this is something that starts with Bush Sr. George Bush Sr. was the first of what you could call the, quote, neocons, pushing more of this globalist agenda. And then we got the Clintons, and then we got Bush Jr., and then we got Obama, and then we also had Biden. So of those guys and their administrations leading the United States and its government, it's constant turmoil. It's constant, we're gonna make this promise, and then they break this promise. So key instances of assurances that were made. We have one that was February 6th of 1990. We have February 9th of 1990, February 10th of 1990. These are all, just dates to throw at you, to actually provide you with the times that assurances were made. That first one was by Douglas Hurd, James Baker. We have NATO's Secretary General, Manfred Warner, May 17 of 1990. Warner stated in Brussels that NATO's readiness not to deploy troops outside Germany provided firm security guarantees for the Soviet Union. We're not gonna go further. We won't. We know this is for firm security guarantees. March of 1991, John Mayer his assurance to Dmitry Yazov. British Prime Minister John Mayer responding to Soviet Defense Ministry Dmitry Yazov concerns about Eastern European interest in NATO, about Eastern European, like right on the border of Russia. He reportedly assured him that, quote, nothing of the sort will ever happen. Don't you worry about it, Russia. We won't ever expand. We won't expand NATO. We won't do it. Don't you worry about it. So, at least five documented instances starting in 1990 where Western leaders, U.S., German, British, or when it came to NATO in general, provided assurances to Soviet leaders that NATO would not expand eastward beyond a unified Germany. Okay? We'll unify Germany, but we're not going to expand eastward. Don't you worry about it, once again. These promises were broken. We had 1999 with the first wave of Eastern expansion. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO. 1990. 2004, second wave, including the Baltic states, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia joined NATO. Wait a minute. You promised us in the 90s, you assured us 5 separate times that you would not do this. We're going to do it anyway because we don't, ultimately when promises are given by evil people who serve Satan, the father of lies, they don't care about their word. They don't care about their promises. So that was the second wave of expansion. That was in 2004. We had 2008, the NATO's Bucharest Summit Declaration. NATO declared that Ukraine and Georgia, quote, will become members of NATO in the future. No specific timeline was given, but that was in 2008. That we have Ukraine and Georgia right there on the border of Russia. We will bring them into NATO. Do you think Russia is cool with this? That you're going to actually have this alliance of many, many nations, military might of many nations all supporting each other, and you're going to have it right on our doorstep when you promised us that you would never expand NATO? 2014 to the 2020, so 6-year. Intensified cooperation with Ukraine. So this is in 14 with Obama. After Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, NATO suspended practical cooperation with Russia and increased support for Ukraine, including military training and partnerships. And then we get into the Biden era, 2020 to 22. 2020 to 22. NATO's ongoing military support for Ukraine, including joint exercises and equipment transfers, was seen by Russia as de facto integration. And so total perceived breaches, and it says perceived, but these are breaches. Absolutely. 5 major waves or events: 1999, 2004, 2008, 2014, and then 2020 to 22. All during this time, all during the time of the neocon presidents. Trump's not a part of it. And that's the thing that they've always hated about Donald Trump, is because he's not out of control, but he's out of their control. These people, these neocons, have been for decades pushing all of these buttons, ultimately leading the world towards a global catastrophe of nuclear proportions. And it's all about making promises and breaking those promises. Now, Russian warnings against NATO expansion towards Ukraine since this is just since 2013. So 2013 and 14, Euromaidan and Crimea annexation. That started in 2013. Excuse me. That was following Ukraine's Euromaidan protests and the ousting of pro-Russian President Yanukovych, which we overthrew. We overthrew Yanukovych. Russia annexed Crimea, citing NATO's growing influence in Ukraine as a threat. Putin claimed NATO's potential presence in Crimea, like naval bases in Sevastopol, would endanger southern Russia. Absolutely it does. It's an existential threat. February of 2007 is Putin's Munich speech. Putin, 2007 Munich Security Conference speech is a critical reference point. He accused the West of breaking assurances against NATO expansion, stating it threatened Russian security and undermining international law. 2008, Dmitry Medvedev, that's president at the time, Medvedev, warned that Ukraine's potential NATO membership would cause a, quote, deep crisis in Russia-Ukraine relations and harm ties with the West. They've been saying this for years, for decades. 2014, another example of that. 2021, we have July of 2021, Putin published an essay asserting that Russians and Ukrainians are, quote, one people, and that Ukraine's Western alignment, including NATO aspirations, was a threat to Russian security. He warned of consequences if Ukraine continued its drift toward NATO. July of 21, just several months before the war begins, that stop doing this. Stop actually joining yourselves militarily to these Western nations which have consistently made promises and broken those promises. You are right on our doorstep, Ukraine. December of 21, Russia's security demands. So this is just months before the war starts. Russia submitted a draft security treaties to NATO and the U.S. demanding a legally binding commitment to halt NATO expansion, specifically barring Ukraine's membership. These demands were rejected as NATO insisted on its open door policy. That anyone who wants to join NATO, they can join. What do you think Russia's going to do? Like, you'd have to be an idiot to think that they're just going to sit on their heels just sit back on their heels and just let this happen. So, in total, you've got 7 significant warnings since 2007. 7 that are focusing on Ukraine's NATO aspirations and broader eastward expansion. These warnings consistently frame NATO's actions as a direct security threat. It's astonishing. It's astonishing to me that we've had these United States presidents for decades that have not been men of their word. And that's one of the main things that I love about President Donald Trump. One of his slogans, promises made, promises kept. He campaigns on these are the things that I am promising the American people. And he does what he promises. But you can't say that about any of these neocon presidents. You can't say that about George Bush Sr., who was the vice president of the last really great president before Trump, and that was Ronald Reagan. So you had Ronald Reagan, who brought down the Soviet Union, praise God. But then you get his vice president, President George Bush Sr., and then Clinton, and then Jr., and then Obama, and then Obama's vice president, Biden. And all of these people are liars. All of them. They don't give a damn about their word. They don't give a damn about their promises. They promise one thing and they say, I don't care. I'm going to break that promise because we have an agenda that we are pushing. And so it's absolutely no surprise. It's no surprise to me at all why the war began and why Russia, quote, invaded Ukraine. They're putting their foot down and saying, we're going to put a stop to this. We will put a stop to this because this is an existential threat. We have been warning you for decades to stop doing it. You just keep doing it. So we need to actually draw the line somewhere.